In the soft pre-dawn glow over Washington, D.C., a city renowned for its political heartbeat and storied history, an atmosphere of anticipation and quiet defiance stirred beneath the surface. It was on one such misty morning that Karoline Leavitt, a veteran media critic known for her relentless pursuit of truth, received an email that would soon change the course of an entire broadcast, and perhaps even the broader media landscape. The subject line of the message read, "Direct, exclusive panel discussion, media accountability and modern politics." 3 days before a highly publicized live broadcast on one of the nation's most influential networks, the email arrived. Yet, something in its tone and timing struck Karoline as deeply off-kilter. It wasn't a gracious invitation to join a balanced conversation. It was a meticulously designed trap. The panel was set to be comprised entirely of renowned liberal reporters, voices that had long maintained the status quo of a carefully curated narrative. She instantly recognized that this ambush was not an opportunity for genuine debate, but rather an orchestrated attempt to isolate her dissenting perspective and discredit her arguments. In the hours following the email's arrival, Karoline's mind raced through memories of past encounters with mainstream media. Each previous debate, each panel discussion, had felt like a rehearsed performance, where questions were tailored to trap her rather than foster genuine discourse. Now, as she sat alone in her modest apartment, the quiet hum of the city outside blending with the rhythmic tapping of her keyboard, she resolved that this time, the trap would be turned on its head. Over the next 72 hours, Karoline immersed herself in relentless research. Surrounded by stacks of printed articles, annotated memos, and flickering screens displaying archived broadcasts, she methodically compiled an arsenal of evidence. Her living room transformed into a war room where every detail mattered. Comparisons of retracted articles, internal emails leaked from the very network hosting the debate, and video clips showing stark inconsistencies in the network's portrayal of similar events. She noted, with mounting anger and determination, how incendiary rhetoric was condemned when delivered by one political faction, yet celebrated when uttered by its ideological counterpart. Every piece of evidence reaffirmed her long-held belief that the media's claim to impartiality was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. When the day of the broadcast finally arrived, Karoline stepped out into a city that seemed to pulse with a mix of excitement and foreboding. The busy avenues of Washington were alive with chatter about the upcoming debate, though few suspected that what was about to unfold would spark a national conversation. The sleek, modern building that housed the studio loomed before her, a stark edifice of glass and steel, concealing within its walls a stage set not for balanced discourse, but for an elaborate performance. Inside, the atmosphere was meticulously controlled. As she walked through a corridor of polished marble floors and muted lighting, every detail whispered of a preordained narrative. The set was a study in precision, dark wood paneling, strategically placed ambient lighting that created dramatic shadows, and cameras that tracked each movement with an almost obsessive scrutiny. At the heart of this orchestrated arena sat moderator Charles Whitman, a veteran whose reputation for maintaining control in live broadcasts was as polished as his smile. Greeting her with rehearsed cordiality, he said, "Glad you could join us, Karoline. We've been looking forward to your insights." His tone, while outwardly warm, carried an undercurrent of patronization, a subtle signal that everything had been arranged to keep her on the defensive. Taking her seat at the long, gleaming table, Karoline exchanged brief, measured nods with the other panelists. They were all well-known liberal reporters, faces honed by years of media training, their expressions too practiced to betray any hint of genuine debate. The studio, designed to project an aura of sterile neutrality, was anything but neutral underneath. It was a stage where every element, from the set design to the carefully timed camera angles, worked together to reinforce a predetermined narrative. As the broadcast began, familiar fanfare filled the air, a jingle that seemed to dissolve the silence and usher in the expected rhythm of the debate. Charles introduced the central question with a calm precision. "Tonight, We explore whether media bias is a myth or an insidious reality that undermines our democracy. Karoline Leavitt, given your prominent critiques of the media, how do you respond to those who claim that your arguments are simply an attempt to undermine journalism itself? The question, though phrased with apparent fairness, was laden with expectation. It was a trap designed to force her into a corner, to evoke a defensive reaction that would then be exploited. One by one, the other panelists spoke. Jennifer Langston leaned forward with a practiced smile and declared, "Facts, after all, are neutral. They exist outside of any political agenda." Mark Feldman added in a measured tone, "Context is everything. What might appear as bias is often a matter of perspective, a necessary nuance in interpreting complex events." Their statements, though seemingly reasoned, were nothing more than rehearsed lines meant to drown out any challenge to the established narrative. Then, as the moderator turned his attention to her, a heavy silence fell over the studio. The air grew thick with expectation, every eye fixed on Karoline. With a deep, steadying breath, she began to speak, not with the rush of a defensive retort, but with a deliberate, measured cadence that commanded attention. "There's indeed a real issue at hand," she said, her voice calm yet resolute. "But this isn't simply about media bias in the abstract. It's about double standards and the selective application of accountability. When the same incendiary language is condemned when uttered by one political side and lauded when echoed by the other, it isn't a matter of mere context. It's a calculated distortion of the truth." As she spoke, her eyes swept across the table, briefly capturing the subtle shifts in the expressions of her fellow panelists. There was a flicker of surprise, a tightening of lips, and an almost imperceptible change in posture. It was as if the carefully constructed edifice of their scripted dialogue was beginning to crumble under the weight of her conviction. Reaching into a neatly organized folder at the side of her chair, Karoline laid out a series of documents for all to see. "Allow me to present the facts," she continued, her voice unwavering. The first document was a side-by-side comparison of two articles, one condemning a conservative political figure for using incendiary rhetoric, and the other exonerating a liberal counterpart for the very same words. The differences were stark, the evidence irrefutable. As she methodically pointed out each inconsistency, the room fell silent. The moderator tried to interject, murmuring, "Karoline, we must consider that context matters," but she was quick to cut him off. "Context matters only when it conveniently supports a predetermined narrative," she retorted sharply. "When definitions are manipulated to shield one side while exposing the other to relentless criticism, neutrality is no longer the goal. It becomes a tool of distortion." At that moment, the tension in the studio was palpable. Mark Feldman's confident demeanor visibly wavered, and even Jennifer Langston's practiced smile faltered as the truth of her evidence began to sink in. The camera zoomed in on the stack of documents, each page meticulously marked and annotated with undeniable facts. But Karoline was not finished. With a swift, deliberate motion, she activated a tablet that had been discreetly positioned beside her. The large studio monitor behind her sprang to life, displaying a series of video clips that she had painstakingly curated. The first clip showed a well-known anchor from the network passionately condemning a conservative politician for inciting division. The second clip, equally striking, revealed the same anchor praising a liberal politician for employing identical rhetoric. The juxtaposition was clear and damning. "These are not isolated incidents," Karoline declared, her voice rising slightly in intensity as she addressed both the studio and the millions watching live. "They are part of a pattern, a systematic effort to control the narrative by choosing which voices are amplified and which are silenced. This is not about differing opinions. It's about a deliberate manipulation of context and a betrayal of the public trust." The clips played out in a loop, and the studio atmosphere shifted dramatically. The moderator's previously assured composure gave way to palpable anxiety, his eyes darting to the control booth as if searching for an escape. The panelists, caught off guard by the barrage of evidence, exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time that night, The facade of rehearsed dialogue and predetermined responses began to crumble. As the live debate progressed, Karoline's relentless pursuit of the truth became the focal point of the entire broadcast. With each piece of evidence she presented, she dismantled the scripted narratives that had been carefully designed to marginalize her. She introduced internal memos that revealed how certain news outlets were instructed to downplay scandals involving favored political figures. She showcased graphs illustrating vast discrepancies in the airtime devoted to scandals, depending on the political alignment of those involved. And she cited testimonies from anonymous insiders who confirmed that the very notion of impartiality was a myth engineered to serve corporate and political interests. At one point, a particularly damning internal memo appeared on the screen, a document that detailed instructions from a high-ranking editor to suppress coverage of a damaging story, ostensibly to protect a favored narrative. Karoline held the document up for all to see. "This is not speculation," she said, her voice steady and authoritative. "This is proof that when inconvenient truths emerge, they are not addressed head-on. Instead, they are buried under layers of spin, revised fact checks, and sanitized narratives designed to maintain the status quo." The moderator, Charles Whitman, attempted once more to regain control of the discussion. "Karoline, these are serious allegations," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Are you suggesting that the entire media establishment is complicit in this manipulation?" His question, meant to deflect and dilute her argument, only served to further expose the fragility of the panel's carefully maintained narrative. "I am presenting documented facts," Karoline replied firmly. "When corrections and retractions come too late, after the damage has been done, it is not a mistake, but a deliberate choice. The responsibility to inform the public accurately is not something that can be applied selectively based on political convenience. Accountability must be universal, or it is nothing more than a tool for those in power to control the narrative." As her words echoed through the studio, the impact of her message began to resonate far beyond the polished walls of the set. Across the nation, millions of viewers tuned in live, their faces illuminated by the glow of television screens, as they witnessed a confrontation that challenged the very foundations of trust in modern journalism. Social media platforms erupted with real-time commentary. Hashtags demanding transparency and calling for reform began trending. Independent bloggers and fact-checkers quickly circulated Karoline's evidence, dissecting every detail of her argument and exposing inconsistencies in media coverage that had long gone unchallenged. Outside the studio, as the broadcast ended and the cameras were turned off, a new kind of dialogue had begun. In the following hours, unedited footage of the entire debate spread like wildfire online. Clips of Karoline's unyielding rebuttals, the damning video comparisons, and the raw, unfiltered evidence were shared and reshared, reaching a broader audience than the original broadcast ever could. News outlets, forced to respond to the overwhelming public reaction, began running stories questioning the integrity of the mainstream media. Editorials appeared that admitted, even if reluctantly, that the selective application of accountability was a systemic problem that needed to be addressed. Later that evening, in the solitude of her hotel room, Karoline sat by the window with a cup of cooling coffee, scrolling through a flood of messages on her phone. There were expressions of admiration, testimonies of how her words had empowered viewers to question long-held assumptions, and impassioned calls for reform in media practices. One message in particular stood out. "For the first time in years, I feel like someone has truly spoken the truth. Thank you for challenging the narrative." In that quiet moment, Karoline felt a deep sense of vindication. She realized that her battle was not just against a single panel or a single network. It was a fight for the very soul of public discourse. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of that historic broadcast continued to grow. Media watchdogs and independent journalists scrutinized every second of a live debate, analyzing body language, tone, and the deliberate editing choices that followed. Politicians from across the spectrum were compelled to address the issues Karoline had raised. Public trust in mainstream outlets, already on a decline, hit an all-time low as more citizens demanded that the media be held to the same rigorous standards it imposed on political adversaries. Karoline herself became a symbol of accountability, a beacon of unwavering courage in the face of orchestrated spin. Invitations to speak at public forums, universities, and independent media events poured in. At one such forum, addressing a diverse audience of activists, academics, and concerned citizens, she reiterated the core message of her confrontation. The truth is not a commodity to be manipulated or suppressed. It is a collective responsibility. When we allow a select few to control the narrative, we surrender our right to question, to challenge, and ultimately, to be free. Her words resonated deeply, sparking passionate discussions about the need for transparency and reform in the media. As weeks turned into months, the debate over media accountability evolved into a broader movement. Independent platforms saw unprecedented growth, and alternative voices gained traction as more people rejected the sanitized narratives of traditional outlets. Congressional hearings were held to investigate the practices of major networks, and legislative proposals aimed at ensuring greater media transparency were brought to the forefront. While the struggle was far from over, the momentum of change was undeniable. For Karoline Leavitt, the battle had just begun. Every new piece of evidence she uncovered, every public discussion ignited by her confrontation, reinforced her belief that accountability was not negotiable. The meticulously planned ambush had inadvertently become the spark that lit a fire that demanded a future where truth could no longer be confined by the shackles of convenience and selective editing. Standing on a modest stage at a national media conference a year later, Karoline addressed an audience that spanned multiple generations and ideologies. We live in a time when narratives are engineered and truth is frequently the first casualty of power, she said, her voice imbued with both passion and measured resolve. But let us remember that accountability is not the privilege of the powerful. It is the birthright of every citizen. When we demand transparency, when we insist on equal standards for everyone, we lay the foundation for a society built on trust rather than manipulation. Her speech, broadcast live and shared widely, underscored a turning point in the public's relationship with the media. As the sun set over Washington, D.C., painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold, the legacy of that fateful broadcast continued to echo. The network's carefully constructed narratives had been shattered by one voice that refused to be silenced. In challenging the status quo, Karoline Leavitt had not only exposed the deep-seated inconsistencies of an entrenched system, but it also ignited a nationwide movement calling for genuine accountability and transparency. In the end, her confrontation was more than just a moment of personal vindication. It was a clarion call for change. And as long as there were those willing to challenge the established order, the light of truth would continue to shine, dispelling the shadows of bias and manipulation, and guiding society toward a future where every voice mattered and every fact was given its due weight.